So this week we're going to start Acts chapter 7. And when we left off last week, they had captured Stephen and brought him before the Sanhedrin. And I want to read the last verse because it's so interesting. They were looking at him for a response to all their accusations. And it says in verse 15 of chapter 6, "And all that sat in the council, looking steadfastly on him, saw his face as it had been the face of an angel." That's just something that you don't see in Scripture very often or ever. Well, except for Moses when he came down from the mountain. Yeah. But I think that's one reason why they let him talk so long, because he talks for a long time in chapter 7, his response. And I think it's because they're like, whoa. He has this divine light coming from him. You know, maybe we ought to just let him talk. Because they do. They let him say a lot. And what's interesting about his defense is that he doesn't defend himself, ever. He doesn't even address the charges that they made. It's almost like, you know, when a politician is running for office, someone will ask him a question, and they don't answer the question. They just say what they want to say about their platform. Well, that's what he's doing. He's taking this opportunity to talk about the history of Israel and how they were never 100% for God. They were always in rebellion, one time or another, but there was always a remnant, and there always will be a remnant of believers. Now we're going to start chapter 7. "Then said the high priest, 'Are these things so?'" So he's asking him for an answer. And Stephen starts out by saying, "Men, brethren, and fathers, hearken," meaning listen to me. "The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham, and he was in Mesopotamia before he dwelt in Haran." Now, going back to the beginning of this verse, when he says, "Men, brethren, and fathers," this is because he's a young man, and he's being polite for the elders, the elder Pharisees or rabbis or priests who are in this group. That's why he says fathers. But when he says, "The God of glory appeared unto Father Abraham," well, the God of glory is appearing in him right now. So it's kind of interesting that he used that terminology. But God did appear to Abraham, and he starts with Abraham because the history of Israel starts with Abraham. And he was first called Abram, which meant a high father or exalted father. And then Abraham means father of many nations or father of a multitude. So his name ended up changing. But it says it called him when he was in Mesopotamia. Do you remember when I gave you guys that map of the land of Shinar in Mesopotamia? And then it was the kingdom of Nimrod. Well, the place where Abraham was called from was right down at the bottom. It was like what is now southern Iraq. That's where this town of Ur was. So God called him out of this idol worship. That's what God called him out of, to come to the land of Canaan. And then in verse 3, "And he said to him, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and come into the land which I shall show thee. Then came he out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from thence, when his father was dead, he removed him into the land wherein ye now dwell," which is where this is happening. But God told him to leave his family, to leave his kindred. He did not. He took his father. Of course, it was okay for him to take his wife, Sarah, but he also took his nephew Lot, and God told him to leave those people. So even though he obeyed God, he didn't all the way right at that point. He wanted to be with his dad and wait till his dad died, and then he completed. But God told him in Ur, leave your family. But he went ahead and brought them with him and ends up bringing Lot into the promised land. Verse 5, and he gave him none inheritance in it, no, not so much as to set his foot on. Yet he promised that he would give it to him for a possession, and to his seed after him, and yet he had no child. So God had made a promise to Abraham. He had promised him that he would have this land, Canaan, where he was at right now, and he promised that he would have seed like the sands of the sea. Wow, his wife was barren. He didn't own any of the land. He also gave him a promise that from his seed, all the families of the earth would be blessed, and that meant that Christ was coming through his seed. But yet, this is why he's called the father of faith. He believed all this, and he didn't have any of it. He had no proof of it at this point. But yet he left his home and came to a place, to a strange land, and believed all these promises, even though none of them had happened. And God spake, this is verse 6, and God spake on this wise, that his descendants should sojourn into a strange land, and that they should bring them into bondage and treat them evil 400 years. Now, what that's talking about is when they're going to be slaves in Egypt. And the nation to whom they shall be in bondage I will judge, said God. And after that shall they come forth and serve me in this place. When God said he's going to judge that land, he's talking about the plagues. That's how he judged that land. Every single plague was against one of their gods, just like the plague of frogs. They worship frogs. And now, think about it. They've got frogs all over them, frogs in their bed, but they can't kill them because they're gods. So God really did a number on them with their gods. All of the plagues had to do with the gods of Egypt. He said he would make war with their gods. Verse 8, and he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham begat Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat the 12 patriarchs. That's the 12 brothers. And the patriarchs moved with envy and sold Joseph into Egypt. But God was with him. Now, that had to be pretty frightening for Joseph, because he was only about 17 years old. And to have your brothers put you in a pit and really plan on killing you, and then one of them says, oh no, we can't do that, we can't kill him. And so then when some merchants came by, they sold Joseph to the merchants. They took him to Egypt, and he became a slave in Potiphar's house, and then got falsely accused, and then ended up in prison. But through all this, what it says in this verse 9, the last thing it says is that, but God was with him. And, you know, when bad things happen to us that seem like, how can this be happening to a Christian? How can this happen? We got to remember this, that God was with him. And God is with us through whatever trials we have. No matter how bad they seem, he can make good out of it. And he delivered him out of all of his afflictions, and gave him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. So there was no one in Egypt who had more power than Joseph, than Pharaoh. But Joseph even had power over Pharaoh's own house. That's how much he trusted him. That's how God brought him to that position. Now there came a famine over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction, and our fathers found no sustenance. Now I can assure you, God had planned this. In fact, he had told Joseph in a dream that there was going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And so during those 7 years of plenty, Joseph gathered all the grain and put it into grain bins and kept it for when there was going to be a famine. And this was all part of God's plan. And at the second time, Joseph was made known to his brethren, and Joseph's kindred was made known unto Pharaoh. Then sent Joseph and called his father Jacob to him, and all his kindred, 75 souls, that is 75. So Jacob went down to Egypt and died, he and our fathers, meaning all of the patriarchs finally passed away, and were carried over into Shechem and laid in a sepulchre that Abraham bought for a sum of money of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. But when the time of the promise drew nigh, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose, which knew not Joseph. See, that was a problem. They were multiplying. They were taking over, kind of, just by their numbers. When a Pharaoh finally came into power who didn't even remember who Joseph was or who these people were, he thought, hey, they're getting so big in numbers. They're going to be able to take over. So he realized he had to do something. The same, this king of Egypt, dealt treacherously with our kindred and evil, and entreated our fathers so that they cast out their young to the end that they might not live. In which time Moses was born and was exceedingly fair, and nourished up in his father's house 3 months. You know, I wanted to read you just a little bit about that story because it's just a beautiful story. So what was happening right there was that, like I said, this new Pharaoh was getting worried that they were going to take over. So he thought, if we can get rid of all the men, you know, the women aren't going to be able to take over. So this is what happened. This is Exodus 1:22. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born ye shall cast into the river. This is of the Hebrew children. And every daughter ye shall save. Well, first of all, if they didn't just drown immediately, which they probably would, the crocodiles, either before they died or after they died, would be eating them. So that had to be so horrifyingly scary. And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could not hide him any longer, just think about a mother trying to keep that baby quiet. Didn't want anyone to know she had that boy baby in the house. That would be really scary and difficult and hard. How do you keep a baby from crying?
Yeah.
That's their way of communicating. Yeah, that's their way of communicating. And when she could not hide him any longer, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and dabbed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and laid it in the reeds by the river. And his sister, who was his sister? Miriam, stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. So she was kind of hanging out to see what would happen to him. But you got to remember, he was a very goodly child. He was handsome. Every mother thinks that their baby is the greatest looking baby, but this one really was. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she opened it, and she saw the child and beheld the babe, it wept. And she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. So that's a really beautiful story. She could not resist this child. He was so adorable and just had this magnetic little personality, even at 3 months, that she could not resist him. Moses was raised after the 3 months that he was with his mother. She brought him back to the palace, and he was raised in the palace. And he was raised in all of the wisdom of Egypt. Okay, here we go. And when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up and nourished him for her own son. Now we're on Acts 7, verse 22. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds, meaning he did mighty things. And when he was a full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. Now, I want to talk about this 40. He spent 40 years as a prince in this palace, and he actually would have been next to inherit the throne. And then it came into his mind about his people, the Hebrews, because somehow he knew that he was going to help them. But you know what? It wasn't the right time. And when he was a full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed and smote the Egyptian. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them. See, he already knew that he was going to be delivering these people. But they did not understand. And the next day he showed himself unto them as they strove, saying, Sirs, your brethren, why do you do wrong one to another? But he that did his neighbor wrong thrust him away, saying, Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian yesterday? Now he knows he was discovered. Then fled Moses at this saying, and was a stranger in the land of Midian, where he begat 2 sons. So Moses' life is divided up into these 40s. And remember I told you 40 means testing or proving? The first 40 years was the testing and proving of his education. The second 40 years, he was in the backside of the desert. And when he had met Zipporah's father, he tended his sheep. He became a shepherd for 40 years. And then, after he goes and rescues the children of Israel, then he's in the wilderness for 40 years. So his life is divided up into 40, 40, 40. And the word 40 is mentioned in the Bible for every time. So he lives 120 years and doesn't get into the promised land. But those 40s are meaningful because they're showing us the testing that God is doing in his life. And when 40 years were expired, this is verse 30, there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord in the flame of a fire in a bush. When Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight. And as he drew near to behold it, the voice of the Lord, this is the pre-incarnate Christ, came unto him, saying, I am the God of thy fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses trembled and was afraid to even look up and behold, because he knew who it was. Then said the Lord to him, Put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place where thou standest is holy ground. I have seen the afflictions of my people, which are in Egypt, and I have heard their groaning, and am come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send thee into Egypt. Moses, who they refused, saying, Who made you a judge over me? And the same did God send to be a ruler and deliverer by the hand of the angel which appeared to him in the bush. So, before when he was in Egypt, the people weren't ready for him, and he wasn't ready to be the deliverer. He needed 40 years of being in the desert and being a shepherd and communicating with God and learning from God just how to take care of sheep. Because that's what he was going to be doing when he finally got there, right? Okay, I'm going to end this right here at verse 35, and we'll start at verse 36 next week.